Never give up a story that will change how you see failure. They told him it was impossible. They told him to be realistic. They told him to stop dreaming and accept his fate. But nobody told him what would happen if he refused to quit. In a small town that most people passed without noticing, there lived a man named Daniel. He was not famous. He was not rich. He was not gifted in any special way that others could see. If you walk past him on the street, you would never imagine that one day his story would inspire thousands of people to stand up again after falling. At that time, Daniel was just an ordinary man carrying an extraordinary amount of silent pain. Daniel grew up believing that hard work always led to success. His father taught him that lesson every day. If you work harder than everyone else, life will reward you, his father used to say, and Daniel believed it with all his heart. He studied hard, worked long hours, and never complained. While others rested, Daniel pushed forward. While others doubted, Daniel believed. But life has a way of testing beliefs. At the age of 32, Daniel lost everything in one single year. First, the company he worked for went bankrupt. Years of loyalty disappeared with one short meeting and a handshake that felt colder than winter. A few months later, his father passed away suddenly. The man who had always been his guide, his strength, and his reason to keep going was gone. And as if that was not enough, his marriage slowly fell apart under the weight of stress, grief, and unspoken words. One night, his wife packed her bags and said quietly, "I don't recognize you anymore." When the door closed behind her, something inside Daniel broke. For weeks, he barely slept. He sat alone in his small apartment, staring at the walls, replaying every mistake, every failure, every what if in his mind. He asked himself the question that destroys more dreams than any enemy ever could. What's the point? Bills piled up. Rejection emails filled his inbox. Friends slowly stopped calling, not because they didn't care, but because they didn't know what to say. And Daniel began to believe the lie that whispered to him every night, "Maybe this is where your story ends." One evening, after another long day of unanswered job applications, Daniel stood in front of his bathroom mirror. He looked older than his age. His eyes were tired. His shoulders were heavy. And for the first time in his life, he said the words out loud, "I can't do this anymore." That night, Daniel walked aimlessly through the streets. The city lights blurred as tears filled his eyes. He felt invisible, useless, forgotten. Then, without planning to, he found himself standing in front of an old boxing gym. The sign was faded, the windows dusty, and the place looked forgotten by time. From inside, he could hear the sound of punches hitting a heavy bag over and over again. Thud, thud, thud. Something about that sound pulled him in. Inside the gym, an old man was training alone. His movements were slow but powerful. Each punch carried intention. When he noticed Daniel watching, he stopped and asked, "You lost?" Daniel shook his head. "No, I think I'm just tired." The old man smiled slightly. "Then you're in the right place." Daniel didn't know why, but he came back the next day, and the next. At first, he could barely last 10 minutes. His body hurt, his lungs burned, His arms felt like stone, but every time he wanted to quit, the old man said the same thing. Again, no motivational speeches, no shouting, just one word. Again, days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Daniel didn't become a great boxer. That was never the point. What changed was something deeper. Every punch became a release. Every drop of sweat was proof that he was still alive. Slowly, the voice in his head that said you're finished grew quieter, and a new voice began to speak. You're still here. One night after training, Daniel asked the old man, "Why do you still train alone at your age?" The old man looked at the heavy bag and said, "Because quitting doesn't get easier with time. You either build the habit of standing up, or you build the habit of staying down." That sentence stayed with Daniel. Inspired, Daniel began to rebuild his life one small step at a time. Not big dreams, not huge goals, just small promises he could keep. Wake up early, apply for one job, train for 1 hour, eat better, sleep better. Repeat. Most days were still hard. Some days were worse than before. But Daniel learned something important. Progress does not always feel like progress. Sometimes it feels like pain. Sometimes it feels like boredom. Sometimes it feels like nothing at all. But consistency was working silently in his favor. Months later, Daniel finally received a job offer. It wasn't glamorous, it didn't pay much, but it was honest work. He accepted it without hesitation. After work, he continued training at the gym. His body grew stronger, but more importantly, his mind did too. One day, a young man walked into the gym looking exactly how Daniel once looked, broken, lost, and tired of fighting life. The old trainer nodded toward Daniel and said, "Train with him." As Daniel wrapped his hands and stood in front of the heavy bag, he realized something powerful. His pain had not been wasted. His failures had not been meaningless. Everything he had survived had prepared him to help someone else survive too. Years later, Daniel would stand on stages, telling his story to people who felt like giving up. Not as a hero, not as a champion, but as proof that you don't need to be special to keep going. You just need to refuse to quit. He would always end his talks with the same message. Life will knock you down more times than you can count. That is guaranteed. But staying down is a choice. And no matter how broken you feel, no matter how far you think you've fallen, as long as you are breathing, your story is not over. Because the real victory is not never falling. The real victory is standing up one more time than you fall. And that is how you never give up.